Hello everybody, welcome back. I'm glad you have once again chosen to come and join this time. This is our next to the last week, by the way, of doing these videos. We'll finish up next week. So again, I really appreciate you hanging in there through this time with me and kind of going through this study together. There's really no way to hurry through it. It just takes the time it takes to really kind of lay out what God's rescue plan actually is, and what it means. And so thank you for being willing to hang out this way and go through this rescue plan, and hopefully you've been encouraged through all of this. So again, let's go ahead and dive right in tonight and get started with kind of looking at the final phases of God's rescue plan. So there was when I was a kid, there was a guy by the name of Paul Harvey. And Paul Harvey had a daily radio talk show. Essentially, he would tell a story, and he was a master storyteller, Paul Harvey was. And it was usually something that was completely related to everyday living. It was usually a true life story of some sorts about people and places and events that were taking place, and so on. And yet Paul Harvey had a way of telling that story in such a way that it was like, wow, that is just amazing. And most of the stories that he told were really from an adult perspective, and were adult type stories. Yet even as a young kid, I still remember listening to those stories and looking forward to when they would come on the radio, because it was a certain time every day on a certain radio station in our local area that those stories would show up, and Paul Harvey would be there. And one of the things that I hated about Paul Harvey's stories is he would tell the first half of the story and get you sucked in, and you'd just be kind of on the edge of your seat waiting to hear kind of how it was going to end up and what was going to end up happening, because again, he would build the tension in the story as he was telling it because he was so good at it. And then they would pause and go break away to some commercials, advertising this and that, and we'd have to just kind of be there at the cliffhanger, if you will, waiting to hear the end of the story. And then he would come back from that commercial break, and he would get into and finish the story. And it was interesting because the way that Paul Harvey would finish his sign out of his show every day is he would say the exact same thing, and it was this: "And now you know the rest of the story. This is Paul Harvey. Good day." And every day, no matter what the story was, that's how he ended it. And so, and he was referring to coming back to the story after that commercial break had been taken. And so tonight, I'm going to pull a Paul Harvey on you, okay? What I mean is this: if you remember last week, we left off with the week before, Jesus had been crucified, put in the grave, and that looked like that was that, right? That all of these claims, all of this story of Jesus, God's rescue plan, it all came to nothing, is what it appeared to be in that dark, dark hour where sin and wickedness seemed to prevail, right? Yet last week we reviewed some of the things that were happening even in the middle of that death of Jesus, that were glimmers of light already flickering a little bit of hope. This light of hope was beginning to flicker even in the middle of all of that nasty crucifixion business with Jesus, right? And so tonight I want to tell you the rest of the story, as that flicker of light becomes this amazing bright light like the noonday sun. And all is revealed as far as the finishing parts, the finishing touches, if you will, of God's rescue plan for us. Okay? And so I want you to turn in your Bibles to John chapter 20. And we're going to do verses 1 through 18. I had you read a little more than that. You're welcome for your homework last week, but we're only going to cover verses 1 through 18 in the interest of time and discover the rest of the story. Okay? And as you're turning there, I'm going to give you a little bit of context as far as what John's timing was in writing his book. So John was one of the 12 apostles, as we discussed, the inner circle of Jesus, one of the three that were kind of really, really close to Jesus, and one of the apostles that was charged to carry on this message of Jesus after he had died. And so John wrote this book. It's estimated somewhere in the late 80s AD to the early 90s AD. So in other words, around 85 to 95 years or 92 years, somewhere in there, after Jesus was born, that's about when John wrote this book. And so it has a very different perspective than Matthew, Mark, and Luke, because those were written much earlier. They were written, the earliest manuscripts that we have copies of were written only within 2 or 3 years of Jesus being crucified. And so John waited until later in life. In fact, he was kind of at the end of his days on this earth when he decided or was inspired by God to pen his book. And so he has a very unique perspective as he's kind of looking back. Again, that hindsight being 20/20, like we talked a while back. He's kind of looking on this whole Jesus story in hindsight, okay? And so that's why it has kind of a unique feel to it, and he tells a little bit different account of Jesus because, again, he had a different perspective. And so let's begin in John chapter 1, verse 1, and we'll kind of read from there and then have a little discussion afterwards. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. There came a man who was sent from God. His name was John. And this is not the John, the author of this book, by the way. Pause for a second. It's John the Baptist is who this John is speaking of. Okay, so let's pick back up in verse 7. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all men might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to every man was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or of a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testifies concerning him. He cries out, saying, "This is the one of whom I said, he who comes after me has surpassed me because he was before me." From the fullness of his grace, we have all received one blessing after another. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but God, the one and only, who is at the Father's side, has made him known. At the end of last week's message, you may recall, I mentioned that even as good as the news of the temple curtain being torn in two was, the essentially the announcement by God that because of the sacrifice, the perfect sacrifice of the body and the bloodshed of Jesus, that curtain that separated us from God had been torn from top to bottom, so that we now, through Jesus, through his perfect sacrifice, his body and his blood, have access freely to go to God the Father directly through Jesus. Okay? And so you remember that good news, but if you remember, I kind of left us with, speaking of cliffhanger questions, with the question, but how can anything dead save us? Right? It's a great question because dead is dead, right? Dead can't do anything. And so how could a dead Jesus do anything to save us? Right? And so why would John then have this kind of perspective that we just read about? If Jesus is dead, why would he have that perspective 55 to 60 years or so after Jesus' death? Well, again, it's time for the Paul Harvey. You see, we need to turn now to John chapter 20. And I'm going to read verses 1 through 31, okay? So flip forward to John chapter 20, and I'm going to pick up in verse 1. And while you're going there, I'm going to kind of fill in what has just happened. Again, Jesus has already been crucified. He's been taken off the cross. His dead body has been put into a tomb, had a big stone rolled in front of it. There's a Roman guard guarding the tomb to make sure no one steals the body and tries to claim that Jesus is risen from the dead, because that's what he claimed he would do. And so the Pharisees and teachers of the law are like, hey, we need to make this secure. And so Pilate went ahead and gave him the go-ahead to do it. They sealed the placement of the stone with a seal that if anyone broke that seal, they would be put to death. And so it seemed like that was that. Jesus was done, right? But let's pick up in John chapter 20, verses 1 through 31, because this is why John was still fired up about loving and serving Jesus, even so many years later, okay? John chapter 20, verse 1. Early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb and saw that the stone had been removed from the entrance. So she came running to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one Jesus loved. Pause there for a second. This disciple, the one that Jesus loved, being discussed here is John, the author of this book, okay? So John is an eyewitness to these things, right? Firsthand. Okay, let's continue. And said, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they put him. So Jesus and the other disciple started for the tomb. Both were running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He bent over and looked in at the strips of linen lying there, but did not go in. Then Simon Peter, who was behind him, arrived and went into the tomb. He saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the burial cloth that had been around Jesus' head. The cloth was folded up by itself, separate from the linen. Finally, the other disciple who had reached the tomb first also went inside. He saw and believed. They still did not understand from Scripture that Jesus had to rise from the dead. Then the disciples went back to their homes, but Mary stood outside the tomb crying. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. They asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" "They have taken my Lord away," she said, "and I don't know where they have put him." At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there, but she didn't realize that it was Jesus. "Woman," he said, "why are you crying? Who is it you're looking for?" Thinking he was the gardener, she said, "Sir." Sorry, need to scroll up. "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will get him." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned towards him and cried out in Aramaic, "Rabboni," which means teacher. Jesus said, "Do not hold on to me, for I have not yet returned to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them I am returning to the Father, to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene went to the disciples with the news, "I have seen the Lord." And she told them that he had said these things to her. On the evening of that first day of the week, when the disciples were together with the doors locked for fear of the Jews, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." After he said this, he showed them his hands and his side. The disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord, and this would include John that wrote this book. Again, Jesus said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, I am sending you." And with that, he breathed on them and said, "Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive anyone his sins, they are forgiven. If you do not forgive them, they are not forgiven." Now, Thomas, called Didymus, was one of the 12, and he was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands? Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus is talking about us, future generations that don't have the same opportunity that Thomas did to actually physically see, touch, and feel Jesus. Continuing, Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Look, verse 31 really tells the whole story of why John was still on fire for Jesus. John was there. John saw him killed. John watched him being crucified. He was there at the crucifixion site watching all that had happened to Jesus. He saw him die, right? He knew he was dead. And yet 3 days later, John spoke to the living, resurrected Jesus. It completely changed him. It completely changed his perspective. In fact, it changed all of the apostles' perspective. Every apostle of Jesus died for their faith as a martyr. All of them. Church history tells us that all of the apostles were killed for their faith and would not renounce Jesus because they had seen him. And John, the only one who didn't die that way, died an old man in prison because of his faith. In fact, that's when he wrote this letter, was when he was on this island called Patmos. It was essentially a prison island that the Romans used as just a prison, kind of like Alcatraz to us. And kind of in our frame of reference, it was an island out in the middle of the sea and there's no way to escape it. And so that was their prison. And that's where John died because he would not renounce his faith in Jesus. And why would these men be so passionate to not renounce Jesus? It's because they knew the truth. They saw him. They touched him. They ate with him after he rose from the dead. Jesus' resurrection, his coming back to life, changes everything. Because even this day, in the 21st century and beyond, he still lives. Death cannot take him. It tried and it lost. He has power even over death because he is God's rescue plan for us. He had to come and he had to pay that high, high price that our mess has demanded. And yet, he couldn't stay dead because he needs to live to continue to intercede for us, to go to the Father on our behalf, to make everything okay between us and his Father. He has to continue living. And so he does. He lives. And that does everything, doesn't it? It validates God's rescue plan. It brings to a conclusion God's rescue plan that he planned clear from the very beginning, before the beginning of time. Because he knew we were going to make a mess. He knew that this was going to be his plan. He knew it was going to take place. And he knew that Jesus was going to rise from the dead and that all would be well. The interesting thing about that is it also validates all of Jesus' claims, does it not? Because people can claim anything they want, right? Jesus could have been a nutcase, right? A lunatic or a liar. Those are the only two options we have, right? He was either out of his mind and just thought he was God in flesh, or he was a liar, he knew he wasn't and he claimed to be anyway, or he is the Lord. He is the very Son of God, and rising from the dead proved that that is the truth, that he is the Son of God. He is the one that God promised all along that he would send to save us from ourselves. Jesus is God's only provision for us. He's the only provision we need. Oh, I am just so blown away by God that he would love us so much to go through these kinds of lengths to prove it, to show just how much he loves us and just how valuable we are in his sight. God did this so that we could be restored back to him, have the opportunity to be restored back to him, just like it once was in the garden with Adam and Eve before sin came. When Adam and Eve walked in the garden with God, saw God face to face. Jesus is the provision to restore that, to give us the opportunity to have that relationship once again. Oh, Jesus did all of this for us and more. This is the great promise of God delivered through Jesus. And I think it's what prompted Paul to say this in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verses 1 and 2. Paul, one of the other apostles, wrote this: "When I came to you, brothers, I did not come with eloquence or superior wisdom as I proclaimed to you the testimony about God." In other words, this whole story that we've just looked at over the last few weeks. This testimony about God. Verse 2, "For I resolved to know nothing while I was with you except Jesus Christ and him crucified." Jesus. It's all about Jesus. Jesus is it. He is God's provision, the only provision, and the only one that we need. We need to be thankful for that, don't we? Anytime we doubt God's love for us, anytime we doubt God's goodness to us, stop and think about what God did for us, what lengths he went to save us. He has to allow the consequences of our sins into this world, but through Jesus, through his sacrifice, his body and his blood and his resurrected body, he gives us a promising future. And so that's kind of where we're going to end tonight. And what I want to encourage you to do is this. I want you to tune back in next week as we finish this series. And we're going to answer this question. You ready? What do I have to do to be saved by Jesus? That's the question we're going to answer. What do I have to do to be saved by Jesus? It is the most important question for every person to ever live. And the reason for that is because all of eternity hangs in the balance of being saved by Jesus, and the answer to that question, does it not? That's more important than anything on this earth, because no matter how important we think things on this earth are, they come to an end, don't they? Eventually, through death, they all come to an end, but not eternity. That's going to go on forever, infinity. So it is the most important question ever. And so please tune back in next week as we answer that question. And that, again, will be kind of our wrap-up for this video series. And so I want you to read some homework. Got you some homework here to read. I want you to read John chapter 3, verses 1 through 21 to prepare you for next week, okay? John chapter 3, verses 1 through 21. And you guys, tell me this isn't the greatest news. Do you understand why I'm saying please like this, share it with your friends? We need to hear this. All of us have made a mess of our lives. We've messed up, right? And all of us need to be covered with Jesus. All of us need to hear this message. Please share it with your friends and family. And meanwhile, I'll keep praying for you guys, and I'll see you back here next week, all right? Till then, see ya.